He was the NBC nightly news anchor for 22 years. He was on the air. Most of us saw him on the air on September 11, 2001, because he was on the air for 14 hours, I want to say. It's Tom Brokaw on the phone. Tom, thanks for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
I'm glad to be in Chicago once again on the air.
Where were you when you heard the news on 9/11 that morning?
Well, it was an odd beginning. I was getting my first really difficult weight-bearing yoga lesson that my wife insisted on, and at 55 minutes into it, I was looking for any way to get out of there when the phone rang, and they said some kind of a small plane has hit the World Trade Center. So I got dressed, dashed out into the street in Upper Manhattan. It was Election Day. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and no one had any idea what was going on down there. I jumped in a cab. About halfway down, a well-known radio reporter in the city, Art Athens, said, "I'm in Washington Square Park. A second plane has just roared over the top of me and into the other tower." And I thought, we're at war. And I called my wife, who was out in Montana, and said, better get up and start watching. I don't know when we can talk. Went directly to the Today Show, and as you say, I was on actually, I think, 15, 16 hours probably that day. And as I said to Matt, I was on the Today Show this morning with Matt again, and what was unique about that was that we had no idea what would happen in the next nanosecond. It was all so unexpected. It was extraordinarily a surprise attack. So when you have a war coming, you kind of build up to that, or you see weather systems develop for big weather problems. This one, we had no idea where it was coming from, what they were up to, and I just counseled my colleagues, don't speculate. We're just going to report what we know, know for sure. So that's how the day went.
How did you keep it together once the news started coming in and all the people that were trapped inside the World Trade Center? How do you keep it together?
It was not easy. When the tower began to collapse, I think was the first one to go. We thought that there might be as many as 15, 20,000 people in there. And I have an Irish gene. My mother was a Connolly from County Mayo, and it does well up from time to time. But adrenaline is a strong drug. The only time that day that I did have some real difficulty, I had a man on the phone who had just gotten out, and he had left behind on floor 90 some of his coworkers who were confined to wheelchairs. They had spinal cord injuries. And spinal cord injury is something that I've dreaded all my life, and I do a lot of work with Nick Montacani and the Miami Project. And that got to me, that these poor souls confined to their wheelchairs, waiting for the elevator that never came. And I had to hand off to somebody else and kind of compose myself.
I don't know how you did it.
Mr. Brokaw, and everybody always says, well, I was glued to my TV that day. You witnessed every image that came across the screens at NBC nonstop for hours upon hours upon hours. Is there a moment that still affects you to this day? The grandiosity of it all affects us all. But for you, is there something you witnessed or reported that still sticks with you today?
Yeah, well, one large and one smaller one. The large one was when the towers began to go down. That took us to a whole different level. And then later in the day, we had crews out downtown, and there was this anguished mother in gray hair holding a sign saying, has anybody seen Tommy Smith? And Tommy Smith, it turns out, was a member of a family, the only one to go to college, kind of a pudgy kid we saw in home movies, who had gotten a job, I believe, at Morgan Stanley. And he was the pride of the family. Mm-hmm. They were a working-class family. And it was so devastating for them to have lost him. And I then did a follow-up. I wanted to know more about them. And turns out one of the sons was a big Green Bay Packers fan, and Brett Favre will always have a place in my heart because I didn't know him. I wrote to him, and I said, could you send something? And he sent an entire package of stuff to this man. But that family, everybody who suffered a loss suffered greatly, obviously. But that family, this was the one son who had gone to college and was on his way, and they lost him.
We're talking with Tom Brokaw. I saw your piece today on search dogs on the nightly news. It was interesting how you brought that dog back to ground zero and how he reacted.
Well, I'm a big dog person. I have Labradors, which are also good at that kind of thing because they're trained as bird dogs. For the most part, they have great sense. And that golden retriever that we saw there today is part of an expanding population of search dogs across the country because they have this unique ability and this deep scent. And that dog didn't find any live bodies, unfortunately. But what they do is they go and sniff and stick, and if they get a strong scent, then they begin to bark. They put in long hours, and it's a very tiring thing. But the relationship that Denise had with Brittany, I think, was pretty self-evident on the screen, and I completely get that. I have a dog now out in Montana, Red, that, is just my favorite companion outside of my wife. I always make that clear. But I do also say to my wife, he loves me better than he loves you. Do understand that. So.
And later that month, talk about a crazy time, but later that month, you received a letter containing anthrax.
I did. And that was a horrendous experience for me and for the people who worked for me. There were two developments that really didn't get very much attention. It was opened by an intern out in the outer office, and she wisely, there was just some brown powder, and she dumped it into a wastebasket that had a plastic lining, got sealed and carried away. And then the letter with residue came into my office. And I had a fair-skinned Irish-American secretary who a couple of days later said, I've developed some kind of a rash thing, and I'd gotten a letter with it turned out to be talcum powder on it when we tested it. So she'd sent that out for testing. Her husband's a cop. And it came back negative. But she said, this thing, it's growing. So I sent her to a couple of doctors in New York and dermatologists, and they said, well, it's a brown reclusive spider bite. That honestly is what they said it was. She didn't make any sense. I haven't been out in the garden or anything. It seemed to be diminishing because she was on a drug. And then she came back on Monday, and I said, how are you doing? And her friends took her into the restroom and looked at it. It was over her breast area. And they came back and said, this is not going down. So we have a favorite tropical diseases doctor in town because I go to those crazy places all the time.
Right.
She knew him and trusted him, to Kevin Cahill. I sent her up to Kevin. Kevin said, I cannot rule this out. He was the only one in New York that we found who had ever seen cutaneous anthrax. We then sent the samples to the CDC and to Fort McKendrick down in Maryland, Fort McKendrick, the Army infectious diseases place. That came back negative. The CDC worked through the night, and on Friday morning early, I got a call from the police commissioner saying, do you have a secretary who's got a problem? She's got anthrax. It had taken 10 days for us to track this down.
At the time of 9/11, I happened to be living up in Canada, and I only mention that as a matter of fact because it was Canada that took in literally thousands of flights that were still airborne at the time of the attacks and allowed them to land at the various airports all the way from the Maritimes all the way out to the West Coast and on into Vancouver, BC. Have you ever seen a time in history, other than, of course, World War II, where really the world rallied around the United States and presented a united front in wanting to help us out?
No, I never have, and I think it was a lost opportunity. The country really did come together, and then it was quickly divided. By the way, I did a story for the Olympics at BC on Gander, which was an old refueling stop during World War II, and they took in 700 transatlantic flights that day, offloaded the passengers, put them in homes, gave them free prescriptions because they had to leave their luggage on board, free clothing, free food for 3 days. There was one and maybe two marriages that came out of the ordeal, and there's a scholarship fund now that the passengers put together for the children of Gander, which is in Nova Scotia, and it's a working-class town. It was a wonderful story, and when we put it on the air, Americans had no idea of what had happened in Gander, and they were so touched by it. And, of course, the Canadians, who never get enough attention from us, were just overjoyed.
Tom Brokaw. Tom, I can't say thanks enough for coming on tonight. We talked about who we wanted to have on to talk about 9/11, and we all said we want to get Tom Brokaw back on the show, and we sincerely appreciate it. We've all been rooting for you the last year, and we're glad you're doing better.
Well, I'm doing much, much better, and I am so mindful of the people who do get far more serious cases of cancer.
Right.
It's a monstrous disease. And I thank you all very much, and I'll be coming back to Chicago.
All right. Thank you, Tom. We'll talk soon.
Okay, bye.
Tom Brokaw, everybody.